Within every human being, there exists one very specific quality. That quality being the innate desire to improve yourself far beyond what you ever were before and to assert your dominance over others so that you then showcase you are worthy of being able to stand at the mountaintops alongside the elite. Put simply, you want to prove that you're built different. But somehow, along the way, we mere mortals took this quality of ours and we applied it to video games of all things. Whether it be coming over to a friend's house after school to see who's better in a contest of strength, or embarking on the unholy journey of getting every A rank in Sonic Adventure 2 for some reason, that hunger to prove that we small few are the exception to the average person shows that, for lack of a better term, we're all a bunch of weirdos. And if you know me, you know that I, clearly, am no exception to this. Action games are one of my favorite genres of video games of all time, if you couldn't tell. Which is why I decided that in order to satiate my own masochistic tendencies, that I would go through one of my favorite action games that released last year, Hifirush, and I would not only beat it on the hardest difficulty, Rhythm Master, but that I would also get the highest rank in the entire game, the S Crown, on all 12 missions. So let's you and me go on a new journey together, the journey to becoming a Rhythm Master. May God have mercy on my poor soul. Before we get into the actual gameplay, let's break down what we're actually hoping to achieve here and the roadblocks we might encounter along the way. For starters, the Rhythm Master difficulty has its own built-in stipulation, where if your style meter ever drops to a D, you automatically die with no exceptions. This, of course, is a very extreme and volatile stipulation and interferes greatly with our second goal to get the highest rank of the game, the S Crown, on every mission. The S Crown is essentially the Hifirush equivalent of a pure platinum rank in Bayonetta. Only with the S Crown, in order to achieve it, you have to go through an entire mission without dying and using a continue, S ranking every encounter and battle along the way. You can still get hit as far as I'm concerned, just not when the battles actually start. And if you do die a single time, you have to restart the entire mission. You can't simply go back to the title screen, go back to the hideout and resume the mission from there because it will still count as a continue. You'll have to start fresh from the beginning, and Hifirush has some very long levels. As for how I tend to approach every fight in this mode, I make use of my assists at all times. For those unaware, in Hifirush you have 3 friends, Peppermint, Macaron, and Corsica, and each of them have their own specific uses in battle. I usually open every fight using Peppermint's gun since she helps to keep my style meter from dropping to a D. Macaron helps with keeping enemies locked down, and Corsica's stun is amazing for building up style points. You also have special team-up attacks with your friends, as well as your own special moves, with the main 2 that I personally use during this run being Overdrive Slash and Double Riff. In order to S rank every encounter, you need to get an S rank in at least 2 of 3 categories. Style points, just timings, which is when you time your hits to the beat of the game, since this is a rhythm game after all, and the time with which it took to actually finish an encounter. With the exposition out the way, our main goals are laid out for us. We need to S rank every single encounter in the game, and we need to do so without dying a single time, lest we have to restart the mission all over again. So let's kick things off with Track 1. Since Track 1 is of course the first mission of the game, you only have the most basic enemies thrown your way, with the only real exception here being the BA-B00 robot, which contains an actual stun gauge, but just parry his attacks and he's really just a pushover. As for S-ranking all the encounters in the mission, I know I made this seem like a big deal, but honestly, S-ranking all the battles in this game isn't something I tend to struggle with and can honestly get in my sleep. By the end of the level, you have to fight the first boss in the game, the QA-1 Mill. This fight is split up into 3 phases, and during the first phase, the robot will only really lazily sweep his arms across the arena, but you can easily parry this if you're aware of the timing. He'll also slam his hands down and try to shock you as well. During the second phase, the robot will start to fire missiles at you, and by phase 3, the robot will enter into a serious mode. As a whole, the main way to approach this fight is by attacking the middle of his body, or his hands when the robot slams him down, and building up enough reverb gauge to use your team-up attacks with your friends. For most bosses in this game, by using these team-up attacks, they become effectively locked in place for a good couple of seconds, allowing you to get in another combo so that you can pop another team attack with an available friend, effectively creating somewhat of a loop until you run out of gauge. As a whole, this first boss is kind of a pushover, especially since he's such a big target, but don't worry, there are more bosses to come, and the difficulty curve is going to become very steep very quickly. But with all that being said, we got our first S crown on Rhythm Master. Moving on to track 2, it's honestly a lot more of the same like with level 1, only here, this level actually introduces some shielded variants of enemies from the mission prior. Honestly speaking, shielded enemies kinda terrify me, not because they're hard to deal with, but because I always fear that I might not get their shields down to do actual damage before my rank goes down to a D. This level also introduces the Elite Saber archetype, but other than these things, my only real concern going into this level is that there are 10 fights in total, making this one of the longer missions of the entire game. The mission caps off with you fighting the first of the Vandalay technology bosses, Rekka, the head of production. Staying true to her build and personality, Rekka relies a lot on brute force, as she can either leap into the air and come crashing down to the ground, charge directly at you, or create an explosion around herself. You can easily parry the first two, and for the latter, I just opt to get out of her way. Like with the boss at the end of the first mission, the best way to deal damage to Rekka is of course, use your team up attacks which locks her in place for a time. Repeat this and eventually you'll deplete her health enough to where she enters phase 2. Here, Rekka will use electricity to power herself up, and once she does, I usually stay away from her until she eventually goes to the middle of the arena and discharges her electricity completely, and the game will even give you 2 grappling points in order to keep yourself safe from her. Besides this and the fact that she can gather a barrier around herself, getting through phase 2 is pretty smooth sailing. Now phase 3 is where Rekka decides to just pull a whole pipe out the wall and snap it in half as she sends a bunch of them flying your way in a sort of dodging minigame. And while I do get hit here, it's only like twice, and afterwards, this becomes a regular attack of hers where she leaps into the air and tries to attack you with the pipes. But attacking her while she's open and doing a team attack makes it so that she just drops the pipes completely. She also gains a command grab as well, but just jump over that when she signals she's about to do it. Honestly speaking, I would say that Rekka is the first real boss of Hifirush, mainly because of the fact that she has a much stronger foundation to her, and she's just much better designed than the boss at the end of the first mission. Rekka really does not disappoint at all, but overall, I do beat Rekka with about minimal difficulty. And as Rekka literally explodes, we get another S crown for all our troubles. Track 3 finds us in the research and development section of Vandalay Technologies, deep underground, as our next target is the head of R&D, Zanzo, the walking reference to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Here, the game introduces a variant of the Elite Saber enemy from earlier just with a barrier, as well as the Centaur enemy who is one of the more annoying enemies of the entire game because he just keeps running away the entire time. It's enough to make my heart stop when I'm trying to keep my rank steady. This is also the mission that, in terms of the actual story, introduces the parry, so even though the game forces you to do some mandatory parrying, mainly to give you a feel for it, I pretty much have the tempo of all of these on lock. This is also where we're introduced to our very first super tough enemy, the Brutal. Super tough enemies are enemies that have a much larger stun gauge than any of the other regular enemies in the game, and once they're about to die, will pull you into a rhythm battle of sorts where you have to do a series of parries, but the Brutal is probably the easiest to deal with than any of the others by itself. To cap the mission off, Zanzo forces us into a fight with the first enemy of the game with Z shielding, which if you were playing this game for the first time, would be an unwinnable fight until the next mission, but since I have Macaron already, who is the character specifically meant to deal with Z shielding, this enemy goes down too. Fun fact about this, if you actually do end up using Macaron here, the game references this by Peppermint and Cinnamon breaking the fourth wall and calling you a cheater as Cinnamon forces the final cutscene to play anyway. He's damn right calling me a cheater too, because I'll cheat as much as I need to in order to acquire these S crowns, with us racking up another one after this mission. Now since the following mission actually has Macaron join us, we can get our run back from the prior mission as track 4 finds us having to drain Zanzo's budget. There's a lot of moving parts to this mission as we're introduced to another Elite Saber enemy, but with Z shielding. This one is probably the hardest one out of all of these, and the brunt of this mission revolves around dodging magma inside of an AR simulation. This part of the mission is definitely very scary since the magma does a lot of damage to my health, and being forced to dodge it makes certain fights a lot harder to manage. Even scarier is by the end of this mission, when you actually do deal with this, you're then put into a situation where you have to escape from Corsica as she sends a giant laser wall your way. You gotta be quick here because any hesitation can spell your demise, as the laser wall hitting you is an instant death, meaning you have to restart the entire level if you want the S crown. But I'm able to navigate the situation fast enough to make it through this last portion of the level as Chai ends up getting captured by Corsica. God, I wish that was me. But with this, we're already a quarter of the way there, as we now receive our 4th S crown. Because we've been captured by Corsica, for track 5, we're now in the security sector of Vandalay Technologies, and in order to proceed through track 5, we need to repair all the broken security nodes in order to ride the elevator down to the lift. This is actually the level that introduces one of the most difficult enemies to deal with within the entire game, the samurai robot. If you know action games, then you know that every action game has at least one enemy that's harder to deal with than any other. Devil May Cry, for example, you've got your Angels, Blitzes, and Furies, and for Hifirush, the Samurai is that enemy. I'd say that this enemy is really the one that forces you to become good at parrying, especially since this is the only regular enemy in the game that legit has a second phase to fighting it. All of its attacks require you to be on your P's and Q's, especially towards the end when it pulls you into its own rhythm game. But since you have to fight this guy many more times from here on out, I can safely say I personally have mastered how to parry him, so honestly, props to this guy for making me better at the game. By the time you finish fixing this first node, you unlock the next two, which you can do in any order you want, and the game even supplies you with a big reverb boost for these encounters. You're gonna need it because you have to fight a lot more of these samurai guys along with Z-shielding enemies, and by the time you've successfully gotten all 3 nodes fixed, you can ride the elevator where one more battle is waiting for you. By the end of this battle, the last enemy the game forces you to fight is a new super tough enemy, the Vulture, but much like the Brutal and unlike the Samurai, this guy isn't much on his own. And with this, we get our 5th S crown. Our 6th comes pretty quickly after this, as track 6 is one of the quickest missions of the entire game. Track 6 only consists of 3 battles, and here we ride on the lift in order to get to the second wing of the security sector, and on the way, we fight some enemies, dodge some construction signs, smash some brakes with the help of Macron, and after a quick crash landing at the second wing, thanks to the help of Peppermint's oversized cannon, the mission is over before you know it, netting us our 6th S crown as our journey reaches its halfway point. Since we're halfway through Rhythm Master difficulty now, for those of you still watching, let me know, am I doing a good job of keeping things interesting? And if I am, feel free to subscribe, maybe even leave a like. It only takes like 10 seconds to click like 2 buttons, but with all that being said, it's time for track 7, The Climb. Track 7 is the mission that, without question, truly sparks the difficulty increase for Hifirush as a whole. From the get-go, this is where the game is coming different, as it not only spawns in multiple enemy archetypes such as a Brutal, some Elite Sabers, alongside a Z-shielding enemy that shoots missiles. I said that the Brutal was very easy to deal with by itself. Well, now he's not alone, he has friends, though I'm still able to get through this. However, it doesn't help that the rest of the encounters in this mission feature samurai enemies and multiple Z-shielding enemies as well. I mentioned earlier that enemies with barriers are probably the scariest enemies to deal with within the Rhythm Master difficulty, and enemies with Z-shielding are the scariest enemies of them all, since you have to utilize Macron's assist in order to break their shields, meaning you can't do real damage to them until their shields are down, making keeping the rank from dropping a very scary process, believe you me. Another thing I haven't felt the need to mention until now is that once you finish Hifirush even a single time, you gain access to the Spectra doors, which are really just challenge doors meant to test your skill. The reason I mention this at all is that entering them acts as a free heal that transfers back to the level, so this is a very good way to refresh for the fights ahead. At around the middle of the mission or so, we face a new tough enemy, the Kemono. Peppermint's charged assist and a quick parry is enough to drain the stun bar completely, opening it up for some combos, and its rhythm game isn't too difficult either. From here, we have to dodge a couple of laser walls as we eventually reach the top. This last wave always scares me since they spawn quite a few enemies as a last hurdle to get in your way, but to my own surprise, I was able to get through it without too much trouble, giving me a moment of reprieve as I can effectively call it the mission right here, though we have to face off with the head of security, Corsica, right after this. The reason I'm not too worried about her is that this isn't a traditional boss like all the others before her, but is instead a rhythm battle where you have to parry her attacks to wear her down, and I can confidently say I'm very good at this. During her second phase, she introduces attacks that you cannot parry under any circumstances and instead have to perform a timely dodge on, but once again, this isn't anything too major for me to deal with. Overall, this boss is just really one giant skill check. In order to successfully parry and dodge everything to success, you need to have a strong foundation for it, and to be honest, this whole level serves as a prelude to this fight as there are so many enemies in this level that the game throws at you that can only be taken down by mastering parrying. TLDR, Corsica is such a well-designed boss that really rewards studying the systems hifirush puts into play for you to succeed, and she's easily my second favorite boss in the entire game because of it. Also, don't forget to catch Corsica because for some reason that actually does count towards the S rank. But with her defeat, and after Kale tries to literally murder us and a robot the game doesn't ever bother to let us fight, we get our 7th S crown. Track 8 finds us infiltrating a history museum with the next Vandelay Technologies boss being Mimosa, the head of marketing. This mission introduces us to the blazing archetype of enemies, introducing robots with flamethrowers, flaming swords, and even a new super tough enemy who ignites his fists. However, dealing with these guys isn't too difficult as Corsica acts as a direct counter as her wind does more than just build up style points, but also helps to put out their fires as well, opening them up for actual damage. The encounters found in this mission aren't too hard until you get to the end, which is where the difficulty for this mission spikes drastically. Towards the end, you'll enter into a room with a generator and different areas of the floor will take turns being coated in electricity. This becomes a the floor is lava situation and is a lot like what I ended up dealing with during track 4. Thankfully, this encounter doesn't have that many strong enemies, which compensates for the electric floor, but the fight at the end of the mission is not kind whatsoever. Me personally, I would say this is probably the hardest regular fight of the entire game, for many reasons. Not only during the first part of this battle does the game send multiple blazing enemies at you, a Kemono, as well as a vulture, and some gunmen. This is all while the floor is constantly changing areas where electricity generates, so at this point, it becomes much harder to get into a rhythm. If that sounds counterintuitive to the fact that this is a rhythm game, then believe me, it is. But with all that being said, I do get past this hellish encounter, netting me our 8th S crown, meaning we're now 2/3 of the way finished. Track 9 is the first mission in the game that is dedicated to solely a boss fight and nothing else, and is actually the first traditional boss fight we've had since Rekka all the way back during the second mission, because after Chai steals Mimosa's spotlight wearing a goddamn shark costume, we have to fight Mimosa proper. To be honest with you, this is a fight I struggle with a lot, even now, and is one that I would go as far to say that I'm not really that good at, but here we go anyway. The way this fight works is that you have to reduce Mimosa's stun gauge as her dress is constantly protecting her. Using team up attacks is great for reducing her stun gauge, and one thing that I really like to do is that once you actually get to attack her, I typically make use of another team up attack since the window to actually get damage in on Mimosa is pretty small. So doing a well-timed team-up attack actually helps to reduce her stun bar as opposed to doing regular damage to her, which is good since it makes reducing her stun bar in and of itself take less time and allows you to go back on the offensive much quicker. During phase 2, Mimosa will dim the lights and you'll have to find her among all of her backup dancers, but eventually the lights will come back on and she'll summon some gunmen with flamethrowers, but honestly this is probably the easiest phase all things considered. After phase 2, you enter into a rhythm battle with her, but not like the parry battles like before, but an actual rhythm battle with her where you need to outperform her and her dancers. Finally, in phase 3, she'll trap you inside of this cage where in order to break free, you need to use both Peppermint and Macaron to break the shields of these devices so that you can hit them, and destroying both of them opens her up to some damage. Besides this, and the fact that she gains a new move where she generates a series of lasers by utilizing a disco ball, this phase is basically the same as the first. And once you deplete her health entirely, you enter into another rhythm battle with her, only this time you actually have to parry a series of attacks from her, ending the fight. I know I made it seem like I knew what I was doing, but honestly, this is the only boss in the game that I just never figured out the parry timings for. I mostly just brute force it, which helps us to acquire our 9th S crown, with 3 missions left to go. Track 10 is the last long mission in hifirush, so there's no time like the present to get through it. Since the final Vandelay Technologies boss, barring Kale, is Roquefort, the head of finances, in order to get to him, we decide that the best possible course of action is quite literally to shoot ourselves out of a cannon in order to get to his office. With literally no better ideas, the first couple fights of this mission revolve around defending the cannon from some enemies while it gets set up, which isn't too hard, save for the fact that we're forced into a fight with the second to last super tough enemy of the game, the Revenger. This guy is basically the vulture enemy, but much tougher since he not only has fire properties on top of several other moves, but his final rhythm game is probably up there for being the hardest in the game due to the sheer amount of delay it has towards the end. Definitely another one of the hardest enemies in the game, but we do get through this and promptly shoot ourselves out of a cannon, ending up in the cafeteria for a battle against some waves of enemies, which is honestly a lot more of a reprieve if nothing else, since these next couple of enemies I would fight 100 times over than the Revenger enemy. I would even rather fight the samurai robot, who in this mission is actually a cook for the cafeteria, which has no real bearing on my actual progression at all. I just thought it was worth mentioning. And after this series of enemies, we're introduced to the last super tough enemy in the game, the Armadillo, who is a Z shielding based enemy, but is honestly one of the easier Z shielding based enemies in the game, at least alone. Following this, we fight a couple more enemies in the atrium, including a vulture, and eventually make it to Roqueford's office, who literally transforms into a giant wolf. Roqueford, in my personal opinion, might honestly be the hardest boss in the entire game, or is at least the one I struggled the most with, even more than Mimosa. And unfortunately is the only boss during this entire run that was able to actually kill me, so sadly, I had to do the whole 9 fights all over again just to get back to him, but hey, at least it resulted in a much cleaner run, so there's that, I guess. And to speak on the actual fight at large, for someone that's as big of a target as he is, he moves incredibly quick and doesn't stay in one place for too long. He doesn't even have a stun bar either, so you really just need to parry him whenever he swipes or dives at you and be as quick as you can in getting your team attacks off, since this is what does the most damage as per usual. Once you do enough damage to Roqueford, he'll turn back into his normal state, and here, he doesn't directly attack you, he only just runs away while he protects himself with barriers and Z-shielding, but here, he's honestly kinda slippery to catch and he really just doesn't stay still, but I reduce his health to the point that we enter phase 2, as we end up fighting inside the vault in his office, and during phase 2, he has about 3 new moves, the first of which being this series of rapid slashes he does in your face, and you need to learn how to parry this if you want any chance of surviving, because if you don't, you might as well kiss your health goodbye. He also has a series of 3 tackles, as well as a rhythm battle where Corsica and Chai team up in order to temporarily stun Roqueford. Just like the phase prior, Roqueford will once again turn back into his normal state once his health has been reduced enough, employing laser walls to protect himself this time around. And it's easy to get behind these walls once you know where he's headed, but he just doesn't stay still, he stays stuck in the ones. I hate it here. But once we finish off phase 2, phase 3 features us fighting on top of a pit of money, to which Roqueford will dive into the money as a giant fist pops up from the ground, which you can use to stun him since he'll try to dive into you but will dive into the fist instead. Honestly, I would say that phase 2 is a little bit harder than phase 3, since in phase 3, Roqueford actually loses some of the moves that made phase 2 challenging, and by the end of phase 3, Roqueford will initiate one more rhythm game with you, which is nothing major at all. And with Roqueford's defeat, we get our 10th S crown. 2 more missions to go. Track 11 acts as a moment to catch your breath before the final battle, as much like Track 6, Track 11 only consists of 3 battles, and also features one of the best moments of the entire game. Yes, Chai, you really are a rock star. And with this determination in mind, it's time to take the fight to Kale. None of the fights during this mission are any hard at all, but during this mission, Kale actually employs Zanzo's giant robot to try to kill you. Make sure you dodge its lasers since they count for an instant death, but by the end of the mission, we blast the robot away, earning us our 11th S crown. 1 left. Everything we've gone through during this run has led up to this. Track 12, the final battle against the CEO of Vandalay Technologies, Kale. Also, the walking analogy for consumerism. Before we can even fight Kale though, we have to free Chai from Kale's mind control, as we're forced to play as 808 for a time, but after freeing Chai, the fight can actually start. Kale is who I consider to be the best designed boss in the entire game if you couldn't tell. Most of his moves are very well telegraphed, with only some exceptions, but that's probably because I'm bad. Typically speaking, Kale will leap into the air and come down to the ground to attack you with a 2-hit combo, as well as calling down a series of 3 lightning strikes and even using some drones to fire lasers at you. The first of these 3 is the main attack that I use in order to get my damage in, as well as when Kale does a counter slash after being hit during a move, which is very well telegraphed. Unlike Roqueford, Kale does have a stun gauge here, and like all the other times before this, team-up attacks are king here. By the end of this phase, Kale will initiate a rhythm battle with you where you need to parry and dodge some attacks, but nothing major there. During his second phase, Kale will generate some robot arms where you need to use the corresponding friend's assist to temporarily stun him to get damage. This is without question the easiest phase out of his 3 since his arms count for a third of his health bar. Finally, during phase 3, Kale will power up via electricity and kick things into overdrive. Here, Kale's drones fire lasers a lot more frequently than they did before, whether it be him standing idly by or when he actually decides to attack, meaning that you have a lot more to parry this time around. Kale himself also add some new combo strings into his arsenal, such as him backing up and doing a series of 3 slashes, sending flame balls at you from afar, or his attacks having increased properties. It's very easy to mess up during this final phase because Kale's attacks do so much damage by this point and really punish you for not understanding how he works mechanically. This is what I would consider to be the hardest phase of this entire fight by far, but I'm able to steer through this fight, and after one more rhythm battle, we team up with our friends to defeat Kale, giving us our 12th and final S crown. Game over. And that's the video. I know I didn't really provide that much gameplay in the way of how I actually approach each and every single encounter within a level, but personally I thought that would be pretty boring, that wouldn't really grab that much attention, and this way of explaining methods and going through things at the pace that I do is something that I provide in all of my other videos, and I wanted to experiment it with Hifirush since Hifirush is one of my favorite games that released last year. I love it so much, and I constantly come back to experiment, try new things, and see if I can get any better. And really, that's just how you go through life as a whole. There's a reason the intro of this video was literally about wanting to become built different and about how you want to become better at a specific thing, even if it really doesn't make sense to. Action games are always something I personally try to improve at, and you can't tell me I didn't get every S crown on Rhythm Master because I damn sure did. That's what this whole video was about. But yeah, man, I don't want to bore you guys. So with all that being said, thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later.